First, Keiko starts working in a convenience store in her 20s. And because Keiko is in her 20s, her employment at the convenience store is accepted as normal and good by all those around her. But now, during the time of the story, the time the story is telling us about, Keiko is 36 years old, and being a convenience store worker at that point is now socially unacceptable. And Keiko faces pressure from all sides in the story. She's hearing, get a proper job, get married, have children, buy a home. And Keiko is, due to all this constant pressure, she is briefly convinced to give up her cherished role as a convenience store woman. But at the end of the novel, we find her returning to her first love and reasserting her commitment in a stirring declaration of love that happens at the end of the novel. She says, "The voice of the convenience store won't stop flowing through me, and I was born to hear this voice." And someone then tries to interrupt Keiko while she's making this speech, but she won't be stopped. And she continues, "I realize now, more than a person, I am a convenience store worker. Even if that means I'm abnormal and can't make a living and drop down dead, I can't escape that fact. My very cells exist for the convenience store." Now, this love will have consequences. This strange love will have consequences, as Keiko's friend Shiraha reminds her, saying, "You're out of your mind. The village mentality of society will never permit such a creature to exist. It goes against the rules. You'll just be persecuted by everyone and live a lonely life." Nevertheless, Keiko persists in her selfless devotion to the convenience store, consequences be damned. Though she is condemned by all her friends, Kierkegaard, I think, would be proud of Keiko's choice, her choice to remain true to her love. Why? Why would Kierkegaard be proud of this? Well, look what Keiko has achieved. She's achieved a love which exempts her from being a productive member of society, and she's achieved a devotion which is tested in the fires of persecution and suffering. The only caveat Kierkegaard would have to Murata's novel is that Keiko is not strange enough. For only the love of Christ can bring us to an extremity of weirdness. So imagine if Keiko broke off every friendly and familial relation in her life, not in dedication to a physical convenience store that we can see and go and visit, but in devotion to a pattern of life set forth in an ancient text, which teaches you how to be in a relationship with an invisible God you've never seen nor heard. Still, I think Kierkegaard would encourage Keiko on her path, just as he would encourage the Christian on theirs, even while all the friends in their life do the opposite, trying to bring these folks back to a sensible life. So why? What is the reason for Kierkegaard encouraging these strange paths when all friends of genuine concern in their lives seem to do the opposite? The explanation, I think, lies in his understanding of love. I'll argue today that Kierkegaard has a distinctly unmodern view of love, and it is this view that leads him to encourage bizarre behaviors. So first, making this argument about his unmodern view of love, I have a qualification, and that's that Wojciech Heftansky is certainly correct that Kierkegaard is a modern thinker, as he puts it in his excellent book, Kierkegaard Mimesis and Modernity.
We are recording that, right?
That's right. Yeah, you have that on record. As he puts it, he says in that book, Kierkegaard's perspective on modernity is that of an insider, and I definitely agree with that. In fact, I've also argued previously in an essay, Concrete and Otherworldly, reading Kierkegaard's works of love alongside Hegel's philosophy of right, that Kierkegaard's ethics can be productively understood as participating in a dialogue with Hegel's modern social theory. So at the same time, I will argue that while he begins in modernity, Kierkegaard does not end up there, a point which is also frequently made in Daphne Hampson's 2013 book, Kierkegaard, Exposition and Critique. My thesis is that Kierkegaard, though in many respects a modern thinker, nevertheless holds an unmodern view of love. And there are two questions that must be addressed in order to set my contention on solid ground. First, how does Kierkegaard begin in modernity? And second, how how does he work himself out of modernity? Kierkegaard begins in modernity on account of the fact that he begins with a single individual, what Charles Taylor describes as the modern phenomenon of the buffered self, the self apart from embedded contexts of familial and social and cosmic relations. And it should be noted that this is where ethics really begins for two other preeminent thinkers of modernity, Kant and Hegel, as well. Kant's rigorous focus is on individual obligation to the moral law within. And while Hegel, in his philosophy of right, offers a more complex account with three essential movements, I think he still holds to this position. So Hegel's philosophy of right, just to break it down for a moment, it's the different movements within it. First, we're all born within contexts of immediate family ties and abstract rights, such as property laws and contract negotiations. And these are those things that you must obey without having really chosen to do so. And for Hegel, that's not really a part of the sphere of ethics then. So ethics proper has not really begun at this first point of abstract right for Hegel, but it only enters the picture as we transition to the second moment in Hegel's ethics. And that's the Kantian moment of individual duty before universal moral law, a moment which Hegel calls morality. But unlike Kant, Hegel does not stop at this point. He proceeds to take up the question of how abstract morality becomes flesh in everyday life. And his answer to that question is Sittlichkeit, or social ethics. So the challenge of modern life, according to Hegel, is to take one's own individual sense of duty and put it to work within all the actual concrete obligations within which one finds oneself, such as the spheres of family, marriage, civil society, and the state. And these concrete spheres have particular obligations. One acts not merely as an individual moral agent, but as a member of the Prussian state, called to act for the good of that state rather than any other. So I've taken a moment here to summarize the general trajectory of Hegel's philosophy of right for a specific reason. It's because I wish to clarify that I do not mean to say that only moderns begin with the single individual, but I mean to say that the question of how the separated individual integrates herself into society is a distinctly modern question. This is a distinctly modern problematic, as Charles Taylor extensively demonstrates with comparison to pre-modern material in the secular age. Kierkegaard shares precisely this preoccupation, namely the question of how the individual integrates herself into society. He shares this with moderns in general and with Hegel in particular. And the movement in Kierkegaard's authorship from upbuilding discourses in various spirits to works of love is in many ways parallel to Hegel's movement from morality to Sittlichkeit. So that is the answer to my first question. How does Kierkegaard begin in modernity? So on to the second question. How does Kierkegaard work himself out of modernity? How is Kierkegaard unmodern in that sense? To answer that question, we must place on the table one more modern characteristic, that is, one more shared conviction of which all genuinely faithful modern thinkers partake. And this shared conviction can be called the principle of material flourishing. The principle of material flourishing can be found in canonical form in the writings of John Locke, specifically in his 1689 letter concerning toleration, where he stipulates that the first duty of government is always to protect and promote the material well-being of its citizens. So whatever spiritual interests a government may have, the pursuit of those spiritual interests may not contravene the government's first duty. For Locke, material interest is always prior and paramount to any other consideration. Extending this principle beyond the realm of the state, that is what the government is to do, as Charles Taylor suggests we are to do if we are to understand ethics and modernity. Once you extend it to everyday actions of individuals, this becomes the general principle of material flourishing, which is that when formulating how to engage ethically with another human being, that person's material benefit should always be a first concern. Any action which causes another to suffer the loss of material goods should therefore be considered unethical. There is no greater spiritual good in the schema which could possibly violate this basic principle in Locke's ethics or indeed in the ethics of modernity as such. So for modern persons, the purpose of ethics is the generation of material human flourishing for your society, for you and for those around you. And this is why Kierkegaard's ethic of love is unmodern, for it departs from this basic principle. It does not consider material interests to be of paramount importance and is in that sense heretical within the ideological coordinates of modernity. In fact, Kierkegaard returns to a view of ethics which dominated the late ancient and medieval periods, at least in Western Europe, and which can be traced directly to St. Augustine. Augustine's ethical viewpoint depends on a distinction he makes between use and enjoyment. And in this distinction, any given reality may be either used or enjoyed. To enjoy something is to cling to it lovingly for its own sake. To use something is to take that which is given and refer it to something else. For example, one might use exercise for the enjoyment of good health rather than enjoying physical exercise in and of itself. For Augustine, the theologian, the human task is to enjoy God and to use all other realities as a means for cultivating enjoyment of God. Thus, this view renders the value of all things other than God relative to whether they help one love God or not. In his book, De Doctrina Christiana, Augustine takes this general distinction between use and enjoyment and applies it to the task of loving one's neighbor, writing, quote, "All who love their neighbors in the right way ought so to deal with them that they too love God with all their heart, all their soul, and all their mind." In other words, as Kierkegaard says, to help another person to love God is to love another person. This is love of a neighbor conceived as the upbuilding of a neighbor in her God relationship. So in this ethical schema, the goodness of a material gift is not prima facie self-evident. Rather, the goodness of any material gift given to the neighbor is always relative to whether it meets the goal of helping the neighbor love God. Another way to phrase this Augustinian dynamic is to say that the spiritual always has priority. Any temporal, physical, material reality will always be subject to judgment and interrogation. It will be queried to see if it contributes to spiritual development and then evaluated accordingly. Thus, that which is of material benefit to a particular individual is not necessarily always right for that person. It all depends on whether that material benefit you are giving or considering whether to give is spiritually upbuilding or not. The singular ethical question in Kierkegaard and in Augustine is the same. Will this action lead my neighbor to grow closer to God? So when it comes to love, Kierkegaard's mind thinks in Augustinian patterns. Love is building the neighbor up in her love of God, leading her to desire God more and grow in her attachment to the eternal. And this is a formal principle that can incorporate any number of concrete actions as appropriate. Everything can be upbuilding. Alt kan være uppbyggligt, as Kierkegaard puts it in Works of Love. From providing comfort, that's one thing that can be upbuilding, to allowing suffering to continue, another thing that can be upbuilding, or even prodding the neighbor to take on additional suffering in imitation of Christ. All of these are possible loving responses to the neighbor. With the everything can be a building formal principle in mind, one must simply use one's judgment as to what will be most conducive to the neighbor's upbuilding. Kierkegaard's continuation of the Augustinian ethical tradition helps to explain a recent lecture in our field of Kierkegaard studies, and I think actually helps to explain some of the discussion we've been having today. Earlier, it was mentioned of the vagueness of Works of Love, but also we've been talking about the formality of it as well. So there was a paper last summer that commented on this. It was Ulrika Carlson's paper, "You Are What You Love," which was one of the summer lectures given at the Hong Kierkegaard Library in 2021. So if I'm correct at reading her affect over the computer screen, because these were all online lectures, Carlson expressed a certain bafflement at the abstraction of Works of Love, that is, over Kierkegaard's refusal to make any specific ethical recommendations in the book. And such bafflement is, I think, a completely understandable expression from a modern person. However, I would argue in response that if you keep St. Augustine in mind, Kierkegaard's positions are not at all baffling. They are simply unmodern, though uniquely and interestingly unmodern, since Kierkegaard begins within the coordinates of modernity. What Kierkegaard is doing is offering a certain kind of short circuit. He is addressing the modern problem of how the individual integrates into society, and then he is swerving or slanting that modern problem in an unmodern direction. There is certainly the possibility that such an ethical position could justify monstrous things. After all, there is a reason why the modern ethical position exists. It's effective at ruling out holy wars, for example, and it is commendable in its ability to immediately denounce things like encouraging abuse victims to accept their abuse as somehow being spiritually edifying for them. That kind of activity is the manifest horror, which it may seem like the Augustinian ethical position has difficulty condemning. Within the Augustinian ethical position, it seems one might legitimately wonder about questions that don't seem legitimate at all. So it seems like you can wonder about questions like this. Should the slave accept their position as spiritually beneficial? Or should the victim of abuse continue to engage with and forgive their abuser, if doing so means they grow closer to God? In my understanding, neither Augustine nor Kierkegaard gives sophisticated answers to these questions. However, that does not mean we have to stop engaging these figures, as I hope to show. These probing challenges asked in these questions we just put to Kierkegaard and to Augustine now take me to a third section of my paper. So we've covered how Kierkegaard begins in modernity, and we've covered how he works himself out of it. And now I must attempt to answer the question, if Kierkegaard's ethic of love is unmodern, what are we moderns to make of it, especially in light of these questions that we've just raised? Answering this new challenge requires engaging contemporary material. And the answer I have come to, I think, may surprise you on where to go at this point. So I hope it's surprising to you. Because I believe Kierkegaard's thought is actually both compatible with and supplementary of the most sophisticated analysis of the question of the theme of voluntary suffering in the Christian tradition, which I believe can be located in the contemporary field of womanist theological ethics. So I developed this connection between Kierkegaard and womanist theology extensively in my forthcoming commentary on practice and Christianity, which will be published in the Kierkegaard Studies monograph series. So you can look to that for sort of further elaboration of what I'm saying here. But right now, I'll give a brief summary of my proposal, first by addressing a few key texts in the womanist theological tradition, and then by showing their connection to Kierkegaard's ethic of love. And I want to pause for a moment and say that I know there are those here in the room and online who have more philosophical training and more awareness of what's going on in the contemporary philosophical scene. So if there's something comparable in the contemporary philosophical world, I'd love to hear about it in our discussion today. But my training is in theology, and for us, womanist theological ethics has the most sophisticated consideration of this question of voluntary suffering. So when you look at the tradition of womanist theological ethics, you see that it has a robust and often conflictual tradition of addressing the topic of the potential goodness of suffering for the spiritual life. So thus far, the debate has taken place over the cross, with the key question about the cross being, should we understand the cross of Jesus as a liberative or as a repressive symbol? In what follows, I'll say a brief word about three major books on this topic that address this question, and they each have different answers to it. So the three books are Dolores Williams' Sisters in the Wilderness, Joanne Marie Terrell's Power in the Blood, ? And M. Sean Copeland's Knowing Christ Crucified. So first, Sisters in the Wilderness by Dolores Williams. In Sisters in the Wilderness, Dolores Williams argues that the cross is bad. This caused major upheaval within Christian theological circles. She argues that the cross is bad. It's a repressive reality, Williams argues, that should be resisted and rejected. In other words, those who have been abused, those who've been made victims of abuse. So in Sisters in the Wilderness, the main figure is Hagar. Those who have been victims of abuse should not accept their abuse, but they should reject it as the working of the forces of wickedness in this world. So for Williams, a Christian theologian, the gospel is about new life or resurrection, which is itself the overturning and rejection of the cross. So she argues that, like the resurrection, we also are compelled to reject the reign of suffering and death. That's the point of ethics within the Christian life. So I find Williams's book to be an incredibly compelling rejoinder to much atonement theory in the Christian tradition, which lauds the cross as good, unproblematically good, and thus risks valorizing pain and suffering. However, Williams's book is not without problems, as Joanne Marie Terrell ably points out in her contribution to this discussion called Power in the Blood. Terrell sees and appreciates the point Williams is making, but she asks in response, what are we to do with all the oppressed people of the world who have made sense of their suffering through the cross of Christ? Are we to take away this sense-making from the abused, Terrell asks, just because the cross of Christ can be misused by abusers? That is the profound question that Terrell introduces into the discussion. And then in her 2018 book, Knowing Christ Crucified, M. Sean Copeland further adds to this discussion by giving concrete examples which help us to see how people throughout history have made sense of their lives in life-giving ways, and in ways that are free and productive of holistic lives and lives to be admired, how they have done that through the symbol of the cross of Christ. So, for example, she recounts the life of Harriet Tubman as an example of when the cross served as a source of liberation. So Tubman's life was surely a life lived in imitation of Christ, but the crucial moment of imitation, which Copeland highlights, occurs not when Tubman was enslaved, but subsequent to Tubman's enslavement, when she chooses to risk her own life and risk her freedom in the pursuit of freeing others. Such a choice makes no material sense. In fact, it puts whatever material flourishing Tubman's post-enslavement life may have had at risk. In short, Tubman chooses to renounce security and comfort in her dedication to the good. She chooses to take up her cross and is rightly praised for doing so. Crucial to Copeland's reading of Tubman are the elements of power and choice. I think we have to pay attention to that in her reading here. Power and choice. It's only when Tubman is free from slavery that she can choose to return to slave territory and work for the liberation of her neighbors. It is within that choice, which requires a certain amount of power as a presupposition, that the voluntary renunciation of the cross is evident in Tubman's life. This is not to deny the interpretive agency of enslaved people applying the cross to their own life. There is still much to be gained, Copeland insists, by knowing that Jesus stands in solidarity with you as a co-victim of abuse. However, Copeland is honest about the fact that there is a particular aspect of imitating Christ that is only available to you when you have some measure of power and can make that renunciatory choice. So the course of Harriet Tubman's life is a concrete example of how the symbol of the cross works out in that way. What we find in Kierkegaard's practice in Christianity is actually a very similar kind of analysis. So the narrative of abasement Kierkegaard recounts in Practice in Christianity is as follows. First, Christ had access to power and to security. Second, Christ renounced that access. And third, Christ was persecuted precisely because of this renunciation of the power that was available to him. So in this way, the double danger that was first introduced in Works of Love is given concrete realization in the life of Christ as we see it in Practice of Christianity. Neither Kierkegaard nor Copeland encourage the abused to accept their abuse at the hands of the abuser, but at the same time, the view of ethics they espouse can still praise the choice of suffering for those who have the power to make that choice. If the choice of suffering still seems senseless, as it does to many modern people, it's important to notice a significant moral dimension of this choice that I had not discussed yet, namely that the renunciations of Tubman and of Christ exert them from the forces of wickedness characteristic of this age. And this becomes evident if one considers a hypothetical Tubman or a hypothetical Christ who did not renounce the power available to them. What would Tubman or Christ have become, we may wonder, if they did not choose their renunciations? Would Tubman have been integrated into an economy which continued to flourish because of its enslavement of her fellow human beings? Would Christ have gained power in a world where violent subjugation of Israel's opponents was the only way to exercise messianic kingship? The world Tubman and Christ are choosing to renounce is an evil one. They are choosing to reject material comfort out of single-minded dedication to the good. And when the stakes are laid out in those terms, one can see why a good Kierkegaardian friend would have come along and supported and encouraged the choices of Tubman and of Christ. Tubman and Christ do not choose to suffer just for the sake of suffering. They choose to suffer because of their pure-hearted devotion to the good. When considering one's ethical response to Tubman or to Christ, if one places oneself in the position of being their friend, the work of love in these cases is to encourage these individuals in their chosen renunciations. It becomes evident that this, the encouragement of one's neighbors in their chosen renunciations, is what Kierkegaard is after in his vision of ethics, especially when you consider where he went in his authorship after Works of Love in the later Attack upon Christendom, which I believe should itself be interpreted as a work of love. In the Attack, Kierkegaard is encouraging his fellow Danes to make their lives, in both material and temporal senses, worse. After all, Golden Age Denmark had, at least for the happy few, achieved a rare bliss of human flourishing, a holistic program of beneficence for both body and soul, a systematic arrangement which had assured its recipients happiness, both here and in the hereafter. So Kierkegaard is asking his audience to give up that happiness so that they might enter into a relationship with the truth. He is speaking to those who have the power to consume the gilding of the Golden Age, and he's asking them to reject it. I believe we should see Kierkegaard's Attack as a contextual encouragement of his neighbors toward ascesis, that is, toward the practice of renunciation. He is speaking to those who have power and asking them to choose to renounce that power. Kierkegaard's multifaceted authorship of ascetic encouragement gains new meaning within our contemporary discourse, in which we are newly aware of Denmark's thorough participation in the evils of colonialism, as is documented in the 5-volume project released in 2017, Danmark og Kolonialisering. To be clear, Kierkegaard did not exactly share these concerns about colonial exploitation, but he did believe that the world was run by evil forces, and he was therefore suspicious of those who are comfortable within such a world. And now that this research on colonialism has been completed and made known to us, it's very hard to disagree with Kierkegaard's position, namely that the comfortable lives of the urban elite of Copenhagen took place within and were sustained by a world of evil. So then we come to the important question for me. Why should we retain an ethical theory like Kierkegaard's, which runs the risk of being misused to justify horrendous evils? I believe we should retain an ethical theory like this because otherwise we are stuck in the status quo of the modern age. If we cannot call our neighbors to renunciation, there remains little hope for the current crises, ecological and otherwise. If we cannot call our neighbors to renunciation, we remain stuck in the situation of modernity, where nothing is asked of the comfortable, and everyone who is not comfortable is just asked to pull up their bootstraps and work yet harder until they are comfortable. In other words, we need to have in this modern world a theory of love capable of justifying the rejection of the modern project, in which material interests can never be contravened. It is that modern project which justifies the dominance of others in the name of our own society's material comfort. We need an ethical theory which helps us to be capable of rejecting that modern project. So let's engage in a brief thought experiment. Say you were there at the beginning of Denmark's colonial planning. Say you were there in the room where it happens. Would you be able to say to that group, when you were in that room, would you be able to say to them, to resist and push against their plans and say to them, yes, I know that if we do not take up the colonial project, it will doom our country financially. I know that we will not be able to compete. We will fall behind all our neighboring countries. I know it will cause hardship within our land. Still, I hold that we should reject this path, even as it causes us suffering. Mitigating our own relative suffering is not worth forsaking Christ, which is what we would be doing if we knowingly subjugated other human beings to our own material interests. Kierkegaard's is an ethic of love, which would enable us to take precisely such a stance in that room. And that's why it remains viable, meaning that it enables us to take a stance where we say our spiritual interests at this point are more important than our material interests. So that's a big, grand example. And in conclusion, I want to return for a moment and lower the stakes of what is being talked about. Something which may be closer to our own lives. So let's go back to that anti-hero with which we began, Keiko Furukura, the convenience store woman. She, I believe, makes it more clear how Kierkegaard's ethic can make sense for us, not just in hypothetical grand rooms where these sorts of decisions are being made, but right now in our daily life. So think back on this story. In a material sense, Keiko's choice at the end of this novel to remain true to her love of the convenience store is a choice to make her life worse. She has the chance to enter the world of ordinary bourgeois contentment with a husband, a house, a proper job, and children. And she rejects all that to remain a part-time convenience store worker. She is making her life worse, but she is staying true to her love. To that course of action, the Kierkegaardian friend would say, "Skål," and give a hearty handshake to a fellow heretic from the project of modernity. My hope is that each of us can find our own heresy, our own middle finger to how modernity wants to define happiness for us. Thank you.